sort things out with him in sort of a bantering sort of way, and so if I hit you with a rolling pin, maybe you come out of your trance also.
The trance that she talks about trying to knock him out of is actually one that she has brought about by the violence itself.
Christopher was in such a physically weakened state that even his immune system was giving up.
The life of Christopher Donnelly hangs in the balance. Hannah Grett Donnelly will decide if he lives or dies.
She, Hannah Grett, has absolute power.
Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. As she analyses Hannah Grett Donnelly from her police interview, forensic psychologist Donna Youngs sees a woman at ease talking to murder squad detectives.
We had a chase around the kitchen table, also it was more, sometimes just,
Sorry, when you say
chase around the kitchen table, it's in a more sort of light-hearted way.
Okay.
What's striking here is the way in which she's talking about what's happened as if she's talking one professional to another. She's just giving the technical details as if she's giving a report to another professional. So it was a bantering kind of an interaction, and I used the rolling pin. There's no emotion. It's as far as she's concerned, what she's done is rational, reasonable, and she's just giving a professional account of it.
If I hit you with a rolling pin, maybe you come out of your trance also.
The man she's talking about hitting is Christopher Donnelly, her husband, someone she had known for 26 years.
Hannah Grett was in her 50s and she was married to Christopher. They'd been married since about 1992 and they had 4 children and lived in Aylesbury.
She trained as a midwife, but in fact hadn't worked since she'd had her children. She'd been a stay-at-home mum and homeschooling them. Her husband, Christopher, had a science background, but he was a very talented musician. He'd worked as a music teacher for a long time and performed as well. He was around the same age, a year older than his wife. They'd been married for 23 years.
So on the face of it, it's a very normal, almost wholesome family life. But at the heart of it is this relationship that is far from healthy. It's a relationship that is based on Hannah Grett's absolute power.
The Donnelly family story could not appear more normal. So how had it ended in murder? What made Hannah Grett, the grey-haired Mrs. Ordinary, a killer? Because that is what it appeared she had become.
There was a mystery here for the police to solve. This was not a natural death, although that is exactly what Hannah Grett had implied when she called the ambulance. In the first phase of the investigation, it was not clear that Christopher had been murdered.
Within your family, what would you say your role is?
I like to know what's going on, to be informed as to what is going on. I don't like when people talk behind my back.
The first that the emergency services knew about Christopher's death was when they received a call from Hannah Grett using her neighbour's phone to say that her husband had died the night before.
Emergency, which service?
Now, the 999 operator questioned a little bit, saying, when did he die? And she told him it was 12 hours ago, and that she hadn't called in the interim because they were coming to terms with his death.
When they attended, they found Christopher clearly dead on the bathroom floor with a significant number of injuries.
And she admitted that she had assaulted him at some point in the past, but he had just simply died.
What puzzled investigators from the moment they asked Hannah Grett Donnelly to explain what had happened to her husband was Hannah Grett Donnelly herself. A slight, almost frail older woman who appeared to have been physically abusing her husband, and one who had built what some would describe as a bizarre home life for her family.
Hannegret Donnelly, in some respects, is a bit of a mystery. She and her family very much kept themselves to themselves.
They were incredibly a religious family with deeply held beliefs.
The extremist religious aspects of this household doesn't surprise me at all. That's very much consistent.
They apparently had some type of view around there being an end of days existence.
With this particular way of thinking, this very black and white way of thinking, this very punitive way of thinking is totally consistent with that kind of extreme religious context.
They shunned modern technology.
The Donnellys' landline was disconnected. They did not use mobile phones. Hannegret did not approve.
Hannegret had gradually began to take more control of things in their relationship.
Such was their mistrust to understand that they took their children out of mainstream education and schooled them at home.
It is possible, of course, for families to be very happy and self-sufficient, to homeschool their own children, to avoid the evils of the internet and modern technology. But it also makes it much, much more difficult for any authorities to keep an eye on what's going on and to raise concerns if they see anything out of the ordinary.
All the reports are that they lived a very insular existence and really didn't associate with neighbours or anything particularly such as that.
Inside the deeply private home, something was happening to Christopher Donnelly. By January 2018, he was unable to walk. Christopher's health had simply deteriorated over the years that he was with Hannah.
We know that Christopher stopped working as a music teacher in 2015 due to ill health, and we can only assume that some of that ill health was as a result of Hannegret's treatment of him. His mental health began to suffer. What's particularly distressing about this case is the knowledge that Hannegret was abusing her husband at the very time when he needed her support. So gradually, Christopher became weaker, not just physically, but mentally, until he wasn't able to defend himself at all.
Inside the home of the Donnellys, the word of one woman alone was all that mattered. Understanding that helps understand the death of Christopher Donnelly.
Hannegret has created a household that's almost like a separate land. It's a land where she, Hannegret, has absolute power, and like any a territory under absolute dictatorial control, it's one where she keeps a very firm hold on the infiltration of any external influences. It's not just a physical, but it's actually a psychological fortress that she has created here.
A fortress behind which the Donnellys appeared in thrall to Hannegret. Detectives focused on why Hannegret had delayed reporting her husband as dead.
Leaving somebody that at some point you have presumably loved, regardless of what's happened in your relationship, to die on their own on a bathroom floor and not to call the authorities until some 12 hours after life is extinct indicates a lack of any moral fibre, a lack of any compassion. It is not a normal response to somebody's death, and it's one of the most chilling things about this woman.
The fact that Hannegret waited 12 hours before calling the police to tell them about his death tells me that even in his death, Christopher remains her possession. What happens to him, even after he's died, is her decision.
The German-born woman admitted to detectives assaulting Christopher in the past. She was charged with assault soon after her arrest. Was an attack what had happened in this latest incident, and had Christopher died as a result of that attack?
As I said, he walked a bit faster then, so I pushed him on the back, and he walked a bit faster then, and then he tripped over and fell, and he fell against the crate. There was a crate, and the crate got broken, and then he cut himself in the head.
An understatement of a description of the injuries that Christopher had suffered.
When Christopher Donnelly's body was examined, 78 external injuries were found, and internal injuries, which included a fractured spine and a fractured neck. Even a cursory examination of the body would have clearly revealed evidence of domestic abuse.
There was a number of crucial findings within the home which actually did point towards this being a long-running systemic abuse. There was blood spatters found on the ceiling, there was blood found on the walls and blood found on furniture, which clearly indicated this isn't just somebody who's got ill and died. This is someone who's been violently assaulted on a number of occasions.
The blood spatters were analysed and discovered that they undoubtedly came from repeated injuries where Christopher had been hit with a blunt object. So the extent of those blood spatters was further evidence of systemic abuse over a long period of time.
Had bronchopneumonia claimed the life of a frail man? Or had Christopher Donnelly's death been caused by a woman made for murder? The post-mortem carried out after the discovery of his body at the foot of the stairs in the Donnelly family home recorded that Christopher's death was directly caused by bronchopneumonia. That can be categorized as a natural death rather than one as a result of a crime. Could that mean Hannah-Gret Donnelly would walk free?
There are different types of pneumonia, and some of them strike much more quickly than others. Some of them are very, very virulent. Some of them can strike completely healthy people and leave them almost at death's door within hours. But others are only likely to strike if somebody's physical condition has been so weakened that that germ can invade more deeply. It seems highly likely that Christopher was in such a physically weakened state that even his immune system was giving up.
For cops, the question, had that condition been caused by regular beatings? If so, could a charge of murder be brought against Hannah-Gret Donnelly? Her claim was that she had used persuasion methods in Christopher's own interests. He was, she said, forever in a trance.
If I hit you with a rolling pin, maybe you come out of your trance also, and then it did get, I did hit him a bit harder sometimes, and then, but as I said, he never, it wasn't that he sort of fell over and lost consciousness.
Hannah-Gret claimed that he would be in a state where he wasn't listening, and she would want to revive him from that. But what we know is that Christopher was a very, very ill man by this point. He was both physically and mentally weak, and any trance that he was in was down to the very abuse that his wife was meting out.
Hannah-Gret talks about going into a trance. I think it's very likely that he learnt to disassociate himself once the violence started.
Was Christopher's body itself betraying the truth of what he had been suffering?
The pathologist said he had never seen a case where so many injuries were inflicted. That kind of says it all for Christopher, a 55-year-old man, to have been subjected to such abuse which led to so much scar tissue that even a Home Office pathologist was shocked.
There were a number of old injuries as well that showed that Christopher's abuse had started many years previously. He had a cauliflower ear, which is more commonly associated with rugby player injuries, and a fracture to the cartilage in his voice box, which was consistent with attempted strangulation.
These are not minor injuries. This is not a fit of pique. This is systematic physical abuse using third-party objects, not just using her fists.
Violence was a sustained, persistent, was integrated into the relationship. It was functional violence. It was the use of a rolling pin to control Christopher. It was pushing him down the stairs when he wasn't moving fast enough.
Terrible litany of awful injuries. And I think the finding of the pathologist is that this systemic abuse had led to his bronchial infection, which killed him.
It was a violence that was very much systemic part of their relationship. It was functional rather than sporadic, intermittent, emotionally driven violence. It was part of the way that she interacted with her husband.
As detectives gathered the evidence they felt would prove that Christopher had been murdered, they received less and less cooperation from Donnelly herself. For psychologist Donna Youngs, as she analyses what made Hannegret a killer, what she said and did not say speaks volumes about her motivation and her guilt.
She's annoyed at this, actually. That's a vaguely annoyed response. She's annoyed at having to explain herself.
Within your family, what would you say your role is?
I like to know what's going on. But
her role in the family, she thinks is none of the interviewer's business. This is not somebody who's used to explaining themselves. It's somebody trying to hold on to the authority that they're used to in a situation that is threatening and undermining that authority.
So we had a chase around the kitchen table, or also it was more, sometimes just,
Sorry, when you say
chase around the kitchen table, it's in a more sort of light-hearted way. And,
As the interview progresses, particularly, we see the body language starting to contrast sharply with that. So we start to see this slumped, defensive body language, these raised, I'm innocent kind of eyebrows, and the over-gesticulation, which is a vain, a slightly desperate attempt to get her side of the story across, to maintain her side of the story.
Donnelly's abuse of her husband is a rare example of systematic female-on-male abuse. Alex Skeel was trapped in a similar abusive relationship. His abuser was eventually sent to prison, not before she had caused huge pain and distress. This
you can't do anything right, and I always think of it as if you offer to do the cooking, you're the worst cook in the world. Then if you don't offer to do the cooking, it's, oh, well, you never cook. So you never ever get the right end, you're never right, you're always wrong. And you're just so frightened of doing anything wrong, and then it gets to the point where you try and avoid any triggers that you know that will trigger her off. So you just completely try and avoid that, but they'll always find a way of reasoning as to what they're doing, but you know it's wrong. But eventually you just start thinking it's just normal, you turn into just a robot, and that's just your way of life, and you can't get out of it.
It might be easy to assume that the most shocking element of this case is that the offender is a woman. We're perhaps very used to domestic violence being committed by men, but men are victims of domestic violence far too often, and what this case shows is that this is a very real problem that needs to be addressed regardless of the genders of the people involved.
At the start of our relationship, it was the first relationship that I had, so everything felt normal. But obviously now I can look back and see things and go, well, that wasn't. But at the time, I was happy, and it was nice to sort of tell your mates that you went out at the weekend and just felt normal. But obviously things steadily gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. I just find it weird that I was a young person in sixth form, and then 5 years later, for no fault of my own, I was about 2 weeks away, 10 days from dying. And I could feel that happening, but it wasn't my fault that that was happening. It was just a terrible place to be in, and there's nothing I could have done about it.
Much as Alex had suffered at the hands of a woman who wanted total control, so had Christopher.
What's unusual here is that abuse does not seem to be motivated, as we might expect, by any kind of anger or hatred of her victim, but rather by an unquestioning belief in her own absolute authority.
That type of control was down to Hannegret's desire for knowledge of everything that Christopher was doing, where he was going, what he was thinking, withholding trips to the toilet, withholding medical treatment, complete control of somebody else's life.
So this very much speaks to a woman who is a complete bully, who is an abuser, and relatively unusually, a physical abuser of a man, but also a woman who has no remorse and who believes that her enjoyment of life, her satisfaction, and that avoiding any irritations of her life are more important than anything else. It may even be that she got perverse pleasure out of tormenting her eventually completely powerless husband.
It was more like, so we had a chase around the kitchen table, or so it was more, sometimes just...
Hannah Gret's genesis into a murderer was a gradual one, and it was one that fed on itself. So with every subsequent act of violence that she inflicted upon her husband, he was weakened. She reduced him over time almost to the state of a wounded animal.
Goings on inside the family home truly were horrific, as police were discovering the abuse witnessed by her children.
It doesn't surprise me that none of the children came forward to the authorities. It's clear that Hannah Gret ruled that family with a rod of iron, and no doubt anyone in that family, children as well as Christopher, were absolutely terrified of her.
Christopher was at this point unable to function without his wife's say-so.
What is clear here is that the level of control and the level of abuse made this an almost everyday occurrence, a level of abuse that had simply become accepted.
It's just so lonely and dark, and you don't have anyone to talk to. I can imagine there was probably no conversations that went on between them other than arguments. It's just the way it is, and it's just a really horrible way to live.
And it was the way Christopher was living.
My sense is with Hannah Gret that it comes from a way of thinking rather than from any profound emotional trauma. To me, it feels like somebody who was almost brainwashed as a child, somebody who's come out of some really kind of bizarre childhood upbringing that has taught her to think in this way about human relationships and about the need to maintain control. That's what I would suspect with Hannah Gret.
Detectives had evidence of abuse and control of Christopher, but that was far from proof he'd been murdered. They wanted a confession.
An interview in a murder case such as this there'll be a formal strategy.
First of all, I tried to sort of sort things out with him in sort of a bantering sort of way.
And the strategy would have been, we need to find out what's going on, we need to get her talking. That didn't seem to be a problem. She seemed eager to talk. And they would then be thinking, obviously to prove murder, they need to prove that she caused really serious harm to him, and she intended to cause really serious harm to him. That would then prove murder, bearing in mind he's dead, if they can prove that she inflicted the injury upon him that resulted in his death.
Certainly, Hannah Gret did not deny using force.
I did hit him a bit harder sometimes, and then, but as I said, he never... It wasn't that he sort of fell over and lost consciousness.
Hannah Gret Donnelly's police interviews are truly chilling. I don't think I've ever heard a criminal talk in such a dispassionate way about such a horrific crime.
And how did that end up with you hitting him?
I don't know. It was just feeling offended that he didn't take what I said to him seriously.
She dismisses her actions as banter and as normal behaviour in a relationship, and really shows no sign of compassion or love for the man that she's killed.
So we had a chase around the kitchen table, also it was more, sometimes just,
It was quite disturbing to watch. She was incredibly calm, not visibly distressed, and almost matter of fact.
Sorry, when you say
chase around the kitchen table, it's in a more sort of light-hearted way. And,
She actually described what had happened at the house in almost a forensic level of detail. She would almost talk about there would be banter between them whilst she was assaulting him. It was an incredibly cavalier view of what was a terrible systemic level of violence towards her husband. She came across as incredibly cold and detached from what must have been an entirely horrific situation.
I like to know what's going on, to be informed as to what is going on. I don't like it when people talk behind my back, and get upset when I feel that there's some sort of things going on that I'm not told about.
We get a glimpse, I think, of the way in which she conducted herself within her household, this sort of unquestioning authority, and she's trying to carry that through here to this stressful situation.
I've met lots of criminals over the course of my police career, and I don't think I've ever come across such a terrifying figure as Hannah-Gret Donnelly. The lack of compassion and the extent of her abuse is truly horrific. And arguably, if I wrote a character that bad, I'm not sure anyone would believe that she could exist.
In interview was her body language, suggesting to detectives that she would confess.
As the interview carries on, I think we see that it's actually starting to become a bit of a struggle for her. The words remain not defensive. Although she starts off confident, the body language starts to sit in contrast to the words that are coming out of her mouth. So actually we start to see a body language that is much more defensive. So she starts to cower, the shoulders are slumping.
The battle of wits was on. Interrogators probing, Hannah-Gret Donnelly determined not to give away that she was a woman made for murder. The quest was on to get a killer to confess. Hannah-Gret Donnelly was arguing that hers were light touch admonishments to her husband.
I punched him on his nose severely because I was so angry with him, but he didn't have such a big cut. He had just a small cut.
Do you feel that hitting him over the head with a rolling pin, with a hairbrush, using your hands and fists, is a appropriate reaction to him?
It's more like this. Helping him to come out of some sort of peculiar trance. I can't say it's a trance, but it's sort of peculiar. Yeah, feeling strangely. I don't know. Yeah, if I hit you with a rolling pin, maybe you come out of your trance also, and then it did get. Yeah, I did hit him a bit harder sometimes, and then but it wasn't that he fell over and lost consciousness.
Her words up a shield to investigators. You
can see she clenches her hands together as if trying to give herself some kind of reassurance. And there's the mystified shaking of the head. It's an interesting gradual evolution of recognition that she just might have done something wrong over the progress of the interview for me, that is revealed in the body language becoming a bit more marked. I mean, here we have her sitting just with her hands on her lap, almost like a school child being reprimanded in a headmaster's office.
During the interviews, the detectives tried to establish whether Hannah-Gret felt she was justified in doing what she did. She did not.
Within your family, what would you say your role is?
I like to know what's going on.
Here we hear these remarkable statements about how she likes to be kept informed and how people talking behind her back.
I don't like it when people talk behind my back.
I mean, the controlling tone of these statements, given that she's talking about her family, is remarkable.
Within your family, what would you say your role is?
She pauses in annoyance. She's annoyed at being asked this question. She thinks it's none of the interviewer's business, and she's annoyed at having to explain herself. She has never had to explain herself within her household.
Do you feel that hitting him over the head with a rolling pin is a appropriate reaction to him being in his strange moods?
It's more like this. Helping him to come out of some sort of peculiar trance. I can't say it's a trance, but it's sort of peculiar. Yeah, feeling strangely. I I don't know.
This is very interesting. For just a moment, she's exhausted by the question. This is the first flicker of recognition for me to herself that she's guilty, but also that she may be being seen as guilty by the interviewer, that she may have lost her hold on control.
The use of the word trance by Donnelly may have some element of truth behind it, again because of Christopher's condition.
Bronchopneumonia can cause a wide variety of symptoms, but of course it can have an impact on your mental state, because if you're lacking oxygen to the brain and if you have germs flooding around your body, you can feel dizzy, you can feel confused, and it's entirely possible that your level of consciousness would drop so that you would enter what his wife described as a trance-like state. No normal wife would dream of dealing with that by hitting him with the rolling pin to knock it out of him.
But Hannah-Gret Donnelly did, whether or not she was prepared to admit it.
There's a lot of pride in the general body language here. There's a refusal to alter her expression, whatever the interviewer throws at her. The expression is just maintained throughout. There's no natural response, and that's an indication of a lot of pride in the personality.
Hannah-Gret had clearly lost touch with any shred of common decency. She was evil. She terrified him, and she ran that house through fear and intimidation. One can only imagine what horrors the children may have seen or heard.
I know how he was feeling at that time. I knew that my body was shutting down and I was waiting to die. I just thought, well, the next time I get stabbed, the next time I get hit, it's going to be in the wrong place, or the knife's going to go a little bit deeper or go in the wrong way. And eventually my body will shut down and I can completely... I'm uncomfortable thinking about it, because, surely neighbours or someone would have known something was going on. I was lucky enough to have the neighbours that I had and the police to come and support, then the support I had afterwards, but why wasn't that in place for him?
Her defence in court, I think, was quite clearly that the assaults she carried out, which she fully admitted carrying out, were not the resultant cause of his death, and that he died of an illness.
Hannah-Gret Donnelly, on being arrested, was charged with wounding her husband. As the investigators probed and received the autopsy reports alongside forensic evidence, that charge was escalated to murder. The amount of evidence stacked against Hannah-Gret Donnelly was huge going into trial, but she pleaded not guilty.
She also maintained the fact that she never intended to kill her husband.
And it was possible a jury might accept her plea. A court would hear the question: had Christopher Donnelly died of bronchopneumonia, or was his death directly caused by the daily beatings that he had received at the hands of Hannah-Gret Donnelly? In a dramatic development, detectives uncover Hannah-Gret Donnelly's diary. Would that help a jury decide if she was a woman trying to help a man seemingly permanently in a trance, or a woman ready, willing, and able to kill? As officers combed through the ordinary semi in Aylesbury, England, for insight into events on the tale diary kept by Hannah-Gret.
They seized her diary, and among the entries in there was clear evidence of abuse, not least the fact that Hannah-Gret had refused to let her husband go to the toilet. This withholding of a basic human need is particularly cruel. It's not just controlling, but it's dehumanizing, and it's a particularly shocking part of this case.
This keeping of a diary is just another facet of the control, of maintaining the control. It's as if providing proof of what she's had as her authority. To me, it's reminiscent of a prison incident log. She sees what she's done as rational and reasonable.
It was a written record of the torture that she had meted out to Christopher. The beatings were daily. She claimed that Christopher blamed himself for needing the beatings.
I have read some reports where Hannegret suggested that Christopher almost invited these beatings. Well, I struggle to think of anybody who would like a whack over the head with a rolling pin. I also struggle to think that a relationship that plumbed the depths that this did was ever a relationship that was ever built on equality.
Blaming it upon yourself when you are a victim is quite common. They've all said the same thing. I thought it was my fault, when in fact it isn't at all. They just make me believe that. Yeah, you do feel as though it's your own fault, but then part of you knows that it isn't.
It's possible to divide Hannegret's behaviour into two different types of abuse. So on the one hand, there was very strong evidence of systemic physical abuse. Beatings with blunt objects, punching, jabbing in Christopher's throat. But on the other hand, there was what would now be termed as coercive control.
The abuse began around 2010, 8 years before his death.
Gradually, Christopher became weaker, not just physically, but mentally, until he wasn't able to defend himself at all.
The actions here are unquestionably the actions of an abuser. In this household, control is not under question. It's not something that's fought for, and it's not something that's sporadic or emotionally driven. It's something that is persistent, consistent, and functional.
These times that you've hit him, they weren't a result of him being violent to you?
No.
Or was he or being aggressive towards you?
No.
It sounds very much as if this woman was paranoid. She was absolutely determined to be in control at all times, and she didn't like any secrets going on. Now, that paranoia might have meant that she felt that people were scheming behind her back. Heaven knows they had reason to try and scheme and get away. So it was all part of this idea of keeping control. This was clearly a woman who was terrified of losing control. That's why she had to keep her family near her. She kept them under her thumb inside the home. Now, that would mean that they wouldn't feel they had anywhere they could go and speak freely, anywhere that they could be themselves. And, of course, anybody that they could turn to for help.
One has to ask oneself why he allowed this violence to persist without apparently doing anything to free himself from the situation. When a psychological fortress is created and a relationship develops within that space over a number of years, he wasn't seeing the world as you or I might see the world. He had little to compare. He had few other benchmarks really to understand what was happening to him against.
What's interesting in this case is it seems to me towards the end of his life, Christopher became very, very ill and required an awful lot of care from his wife. It's often the case that when that happens, the dynamic between a married couple will change significantly. And even though they are married to them on the surfaces, they may still love them. The fact that their health has failed so much that they're having to do everything for them can cause an enormous amount of resentment. And that can manifest itself physically with violence.
Do you feel that you're justified in hitting him like that?
No, there isn't justification for that. But it was like just trying to sort of reset something in him.
Every subsequent act of violence that she inflicted upon her husband, he was weakened, and therefore the next act of violence became even more impactful, was even more powerful, had an even more powerful effect. She reduced him over time almost to the state of a wounded animal.
There's no question that by the end, this was a totally callous woman who systematically, over months and years, physically, really dreadfully physically abused her husband. She also did that in front of her own children. She must have known the psychological effect, the damage, the scarring that was going to cause them.
As well as the picture painted by the diary and the pathologist's report, there was the interview evidence for the jury to consider.
But if you're on the landing and you've obviously had to reach to push him, does that mean he's fallen down pretty much the whole flight of stairs?
No. As I said, he walked a bit faster then. So I pushed him on the back, and he walked a bit faster then, and then he tripped over and fell, and he fell against a crate. There was a crate. The crate got broken, and then he cut himself on the head.
The jury had the evidence before them. The diary entries which charter her physical abuse of Christopher. The medical reports which said he had become vulnerable to pneumonia because of the beatings. And Donnelly's own words in interview. Would the jury find her guilty?
Despite her not guilty plea, she was found unanimously guilty by the jury on the 20th of March 2019 and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years.
Hannegret Donnelly will not be eligible for parole until 2034. Safeguards and support have been put in place for the couple's children. Meanwhile, life returned to normal for the local community. One where beatings are rare and where now they are free from a woman made for murder. A woman who saw her husband as less than human.
I would categorise Hannegret as a victim as object murderer. These murderers see their victims not as fully human, but as objects upon whom they can can carry out any form of violent control.
I want to apologize to my dad. You know what? Don't apologize. I don't care anymore. Don't care. End of message.
The voice of Maria Sanuti Spencer, a daughter of the mob.
I was just thinking about how it relates to Sopranos. I was like, oh, like Meadow could have been this person, learning from her dad.
Maria was a daddy's girl, and Daddy is a man comfortable with mafia methods.
I think Rocco left Frank with the message that any further disputes between him and his daughter could result in Frank getting hurt or even killed.
Frank Spencer was found lying dead in a pool of his own blood. Had Maria Sanuti Spencer learned enough from her father to be made for murder?
You don't win unless I let you in. Do you understand? You don't win, Spencer.
Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. Maria Sanuti is from a large Italian-American family. Forensic psychologist Judy Ho has been analysing the motivation for murder that would one day appear on her timeline.
Maria grew up around violence, and her father solved all of his problems with violence. So it's not surprising that Maria would take the same approach. This is how she gets people to listen and to respect her.
Maria's father was Rocco Franklin. Rocco was an individual who had essentially resided in state prison for a majority of his adult life.
He's kind of known as a tough guy, and some people think he's a wise guy, like maybe he's got some mob connections. She doesn't have any problem with her dad being a tough guy.
Maria's mother, Teresa, divorced Rocco, leaving New Jersey to set up home with her children in Pennsylvania. It was where Maria would meet her future husband. There are some who believe Maria is innocent of the crimes she is now serving time for, including her lawyer, Christian Hoey, a man who knows her story.
Frank and Maria met in Columbia County, where Frank and his family ran their junkyard business. Frank was a very popular individual in that area. It's a small county, a small area, and everybody knew everybody, and certainly everybody knew Frank.
In 1997, they elope. Frank says she's beautiful and she's smart, and he loves that she brings out this sense of adventure in him. And, it's just, she's more spontaneous than I've ever been, he says. Over the years, they have 2 children, Cyrus, their son, and Frankie, their daughter.
By the early noughties, Maria and Frank looked like they were living the classic all-American family life.
They had 2 lovely children, both of them very athletic and prominent in their community. Each of the kids had a great deal of friends.
Things, though, were not what they seemed for the couple.
Frank and Maria, by all accounts, had a very acrimonious relationship. They were at odds with each other constantly. Making up and breaking up seemed to be the course of their marriage.
I think when Maria and Frank first met, they were attracted to each other for similar reasons. I think they felt like the other person gave them something that maybe they really craved and wanted, and they were both adventurous at the time and were living these fast-paced lives. After marriage, Frank became domesticated very quickly, and I think it caused Maria to lose respect and possibly fall out of love with him and not respect him.
It just seemed that Frank and Maria's marriage was really suffering from a great deal of bickering and infighting between them. So it was a difficult marriage by all accounts.
Maria wanted control of her husband's life, something not made easy when Frank had to devote more time to work.
Frank's father decides to retire in 2006. Frank, at that point, takes over the family business, which is a junkyard. And, he's a good guy, and he treats all the employees like family. So this is this whole new family that's coming into their world now, and Maria's not so sure she likes it. She's just not cut out for this.
On top of being domesticated, Frank took on more of the role of a caregiver, which probably Maria wasn't really used to in terms of her own upbringing.
Things went bad quickly. Tensions led to violence.
The police were called several times as this violence escalated. At one point, the police were called on Maria for assaulting the mother of Frank at a school.
The local police had been involved in numerous domestic disputes between the 2 individuals, property damage, property theft, each one pointing the finger at the other.
Maria was described as the Black Widow by associates and acquaintances, and certainly had this reputation where she thought that she was above the law.
There was constant fighting between them, some issues regarding infidelity between themselves and both of them.
As court documents would reveal, the volatile relationship took up a lot of police time. Frank Spencer reported his wife's violence to the authorities between 25 and 35 times over 6 years up to 2012. On numerous occasions, both when married and later when separated, he would tell them she threatened to kill him.
When these incidents would happen, Frank would call the police. He wanted it noted, he wanted it on record, but he didn't really want to press charges on her.
It was in 2006 when Frank Spencer decided enough was enough. He began the divorce process, but he didn't leave Maria. That would come years later.
The couple continues to live together. They're trying to keep things as normal for the children as they can. So they're still living in the same house, trying to keep things looking the same.
Even though they actually kind of physically separated from each other, there were many times where they reconciled. Let's say between, 2007 and 2010. Maria would return to the family home for months. They would have another disagreement. The police might get involved. They had many of those make-up, break-up, reconciliation moments.
Oftentimes, when people decide to carry on when they've fallen out of love and still stay in the relationship, there's a real purpose to it. And I think Maria probably didn't see the point. I think she didn't particularly like rules and didn't like to be confined. And the fact that she felt like she was stuck in this position where she had to so pretend that her and Frank were okay and that they were in love and that they were a partnership probably just caused her more and more resentment over time as she blamed Frank for all of it.
Despite the issues, Maria told friends that she didn't want to divorce Frank. It would be bad for her image, interfere with her access to the children.
She's told people over the years that if he ever threatened to divorce her, she'd kill him. Well, now she's talking more and more openly about what she wants to do.
In 2007, Frank first reported one of Maria's threats that she'd have her father kill Frank. Despite Hemlock police knowing all about the warring couple, Maria sometimes managed to present a reasonable face to the world. Frank, too, would hear his wife's phone messages attempting to placate him during the many times they were fighting.
Saturday, February 6th at 3:57 p.m. Hey, Frank, it's Maria. Listen, I know for some strange reason you'll think that I was attempting to threaten you, or I was attempting to scare you back to me, or I don't know how your mind works, but listen, I know you and I are done. I haven't seen you in 2 weeks except for court. Every day I get a little better with it.
Soft words from a hard woman, schooled in the ways of the mob by her own father.
The more that she developed a disrespect for Frank, the more she thought of him as this little prey, this little victim that she could continue to instill her anger and her resentment on.
And when the daughter of the mob felt resentful, those around her better watch out, especially Frank. Maria Suniti Spencer's willingness to get tough didn't stay inside the family home.
In 2008, Maria is arrested when she causes a disturbance at the school where her daughter attends. She goes to pick up her daughter, and her mother-in-law shows up at the same time, and she gets in a scuffle with her. Maria is charged with disorderly conduct, harassment, and endangering a child because she doesn't buckle up the child in the car. By law, she's supposed to do that. Eventually, the prosecutor doesn't think he can really make all those cases, so he arranges a plea deal, and she pleads to disorderly conduct, and she pays a $600 fine.
During the scuffle, Maria issued the warning to Frank's mother. Maria would have her son killed. Former homicide detective Rod Demery suspects that at the time, no one in Columbia County was too concerned by Maria Suniti Spencer's brash words.
I think in hindsight, obviously people wish they had taken these threats more seriously. But the reality, during that particular time, people were listening and dismissing and probably chalking it up to what they did. Oh, she's a black widow, but not really thinking that it would actually happen.
In early 2009, Maria gained a powerful ally in her battles with Frank, her father.
Rocco Franklin was eventually paroled from state prison in 2009. He relocated to a town about 70 miles away from where Maria and Frank lived in Columbia County. It was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the capital of Pennsylvania. When Rocco was paroled, a number of threats and a number of interactions between Maria and Frank took place, namely Maria suggesting that her father Rocco would cause him harm or hurt him if there were any further domestic disputes between Maria and Frank.
Arguments over access to the children, the family home, or Frank seeing other women were commonplace, and court documents reveal the fear that Frank felt of Maria and her now-released father. Police recorded that the victim was absolutely in fear to the point where he was changing his habits so he wouldn't be going to the bank on the same day. On an occasion, Rocco took offense at something Frank had said. Rocco and Maria demanded an apology.
I was surprised to find that my father wants an apology. It wasn't a little thing, not a little joke. He's an old man. He's got funny ways. Just wants you to say sorry, and I got nothing to do with it.
It appeared from Frank's interaction with his friends that he was very concerned about Rocco Franklin being paroled from prison and being out and available perhaps to injure Frank or cause him harm or confront him over the difficulties he was having with Maria.
I thought I'd let you know because I care about you, because I wanted you back, not because I wanted to frighten you. Anything. I just wanted you to know that he wanted an apology. If you want to be stubborn about it, that's on you. Take care, Frank. End of message.
Frank was afraid, deathly afraid of Rocco. Maria, on the other hand, was pretty proud that it was her father. I think that gave her a sense of power.
There were threats and counter-threats, blazing rows, but also passionate reconciliations. Until, that is, Frank met someone new. The dysfunctional relationship was about to hit an all-time low, and Maria Sanuti Spencer's homicidal potential was about to be unleashed.
Frank started dating a woman named Julie Dent very seriously, and I believe that really drove them apart and drove them to getting the final divorce decree in 2012.
When Frank met his new woman, Julie Dent, Maria became really angry, probably for a sense of loss of control or reality actually sitting in that they were truly getting divorced. She would leave threatening messages and tell Julie, you don't really think he loves you, or things to kind of shake her in the relationship.
Text messages from Maria to Judy were full on.
When she antagonized Frank's lover, she was essentially showing her dominance over her, that if you decide to carry on with my husband, I still own him and I will own you too. And this is all to be expected. This is par for the course for somebody like Maria. She wanted to make sure that this woman knew that she was still the alpha and she was watching everything, and that the only reason that she hadn't been hurt so far or even is able to keep her life at this moment is because Maria is allowing her to live and allowing her to carry on an affair with her husband.
Naturally, once Frank began to date Julie Dent, she would often encounter the kids. Frank would have custody of the children. Julie would spend time with the children and Frank. That was something that naturally bothered Maria and caused a lot of problems between the parties.
Hey, Julie, it's Maria Spencer. Do me a favor. Don't watch my children. Do not get between me and Frank by doing my children. Do you understand me?
Maria saw her family members, including Frank and her own children, as possessions. She owns them. And that's why she threatened Frank's lover using her children, essentially saying, you will not watch my children. You will have nothing to do with them. Because really for her, it's all about power and dominance. And she was essentially asserting that she has power and dominance over everybody, including her own family members, and that these are not people you should interact with in any way.
It was on 31st October 2009, Halloween, the harassment by Maria and her father turned into more tangible criminal acts.
The first property crime involved a breaking and entering into Frank's mother's property where the junkyard was housed.
What's odd is that the only thing that's taken are business records that, could prove how much Frank actually is making, but nothing else is taken.
It was always believed that those financial documents related to custody and support issues that were being played out in court in 2009 and 2010.
Strangely, the documents that were stolen from Frank's business showed up at Maria's doorstep. They only benefited Maria.
The records were potential ammunition for Maria and the Spencers' acrimonious divorce, and she made little secret of the fact that they'd been stolen for her benefit. Shaken but undeterred, Frank continued dating Julie Dent.
They are madly in love, and they don't want this to ruin that. They even booked this romantic Caribbean vacation.
Maria wasn't going to allow that to happen.
The night before they're to leave on their vacation, Maria calls Frank and she says, really, I need to talk to you about something.
Maria invited Frank, ironically, to a hotel in a neighboring town on the night of January 23rd of 2010. On that night, Maria invited Frank to dinner and then to stay overnight in the hotel.
She sent a message to the new woman in Frank's life too. Her reasons for spending the night with Frank became clear the following morning, so she could text Julie about who Frank really loved.
When Frank returned to his home on the morning of the 24th, he found a number of fire trucks, the fire marshal, and local police surrounding his burned-out building.
A court record shows that it was Maria. She later admitted it. But immediately after the arson attack, Maria appeared to get away with it.
Maria actually drove up to the scene of this crime, smiling and essentially almost looking like she was proud or boasting. This is clearly behavior that was not only taunting Frank and his family, but also showing them that she is not afraid of police. Clearly, they were also there at the scene. And she didn't care if people would actually associate her with this or not, because she still believed in many ways that she would be above the law.
It was believed and argued by the Commonwealth that Maria engineered that fire using Rocco Franklin to set the fire and destroy the property while she was away with Frank Spencer in a hotel in a neighboring town the night before.
Maria sends Frank these taunting messages. One of them is karma is just a wonderful thing. I mean, since you've just torn our life apart, your life just went up in flames. It seems fair, doesn't it?
The theory in court, of course, was that Maria was paying Frank back for taking a vacation with Julie in January of 2010, and as a consequence, the home was burned to the ground.
The fire is determined to be an arson, but there's just not evidence to show who's behind it, so it remains unsolved.
I think she really wanted to make sure that Frank and his family remained afraid and threatened.
How far would Maria Sanusi Spencer go in her feud with her husband and his new girlfriend?
You keep with me, because I'm not with you. I mean, it's been done. You didn't get the last message?
I think that Maria actually probably felt a high every time she got away with a threat, a type of crime where she wasn't arrested. I think that it also caused her to reach even higher next time. To get the next high, she'd have to outdo herself to be even more severe, even more calculating, even more violent. And I think that there was a growing addiction to that feeling of power, being drunk on that feeling of absolute terror. I think that she really enjoyed exacting that on anybody around her.
An enjoyable, escalating addiction to violence that would end in murder. The arson attack in the recent past, it was Julie Dent's turn to be threatened.
Julie was confronted by Maria at a game, and Maria told her, "Your house is next."
Then more vitriolic text messages.
You better watch your Julie. Her life is about to take some dangerous turns too. She's going to lose her job. She's going to lose you. She's going to lose everything. So she's constantly threatening this couple. She's trying to break them apart. She's really angry.
Later that summer, Maria struck again.
Maria is certainly escalating over time. Now she's not only threatening to enact property destruction, she's now threatening to ruin Frank's life and to ruin Frank's lover Julie's life, and to essentially make them break up and to lose each other as well. Anything that was in her arsenal to make the person personally afraid and to feel like their life wasn't worth living anymore, she was not going to shy away from. And I do believe that this is huge signs for what's to come, because Maria was essentially made for murder. She probably witnessed her father murdering and covering it up, and she had no problem taking it to that extreme. And I think she really did want Frank and Julie to be afraid for their lives at this point.
In August of 2010, another vacation had been planned with Julie and Frank. On August 25 of 2010, while Julie Dent was asleep in her home by herself, her home was set on fire. Side window was smashed out. Fluid was placed into the home and ignited by a road flare, and the home suffered significant fire damage. Julie, thankfully, was able to get out of the home, escaped off of a roof, and was able to escape without being harmed. Nevertheless, her home was completely destroyed by the fire.
When investigators are investigating arson, they look for a point of origin to find out where the fire actually started and kind of build a theory from there. They want to find out if there were accelerants used or any other materials to get the fire to start.
A jack belonging to a Nissan vehicle once owned by Mr. Rocco Franklin was found at the scene, believed to have been used to pry open a window to allow the accelerant to be put into the homes to set the house on fire.
A car jack, a plastic jug, partially used Blair.
A lot of physical evidence pointed to Rocco Franklin for the firebombing of Julie Dent's home on August 25th of 2010. Folks that responded to the fire saw a Corvette speeding away from the scene. Rocco Franklin owned a Corvette at the time.
Maria is somebody who would stop at nothing to enact whatever justice she believed was deserving. And if she felt like she was wronged in any way, even if it's some small way, she will take it to the very extreme to make sure that you feel punished, to take away everything that means something to you, and to make you afraid for the rest of your life, not knowing when she was going to strike. And Maria certainly showed these patterns with Frank and Julie.
Nobody stood trial for the arson attack, and almost 2 years after Julie Dent's home was destroyed, Frank and Maria's divorce was finalized.
The parties were actually, by law, divorced on June 8 of 2012, which becomes an important date in the case.
The divorce decree assigned ownership of the family home on Fairview Drive, Selingsgrove, to Frank. Frank told friends that he still didn't feel safe.
A number of them had been confided in by Frank in the days and weeks leading up to his death, wherein he indicated that he felt his days were numbered, that Maria and her father had something planned for him, and he had become very scared.
The threats were graphic.
Maria wanted Frank not only to be afraid for his life, but to know that she would torture him for as long as she could, and essentially made him afraid for not only his life, but also what would happen even if he was alive, that he would essentially live this terrible life without the love of his children.
On June 27th, Frank wrote to Maria, asking her to stay away from the house. 3 days later, the termination of the Spencer marriage was published in the local paper. Later that same day, Frank and Maria had a very public run-in.
He had attended a baseball game for his young son, who was about 10 to 12 years of age at the time, and played in the local Little League. That evening, Maria likewise attended the game, and Frank was seen harassing Maria at the game. The witnesses that testified for the government at trial corroborated that and said that Frank was joking with her and being difficult. Maria was a diabetic and a very brittle diabetic at the time, had lots of neuropathy, difficulty walking, and things of that sort. And all of the accounts of Frank's friends who testified at trial suggested that Frank was mocking her publicly and, kind of embarrassing her about her limitations.
Mockery of a mafia man's daughter. Not a good idea, because soon after, Frank Spencer was dead.
That all occurred on the evening of June 30, 2012. It is believed from the forensic evidence that he was killed about 12 hours later on the morning of July 1, 2012.
It would be 2 days before the crime was discovered. On July 3rd, friends who hadn't heard from Frank since the baseball game went to his home in Selingsgrove to investigate.
When Frank was found, he was found in the doorway of his home in a pool of blood. His arms were stretched out above his head, and it appeared that he had been dragged.
The police noted prominently a gunshot wound to his head.
The second shot was a closer shot through the bicep and into the chest cavity.
The fact that the second shot was fired at close range when most likely the first shot already incapacitated Frank and killed him shows that this was a personal issue. This is not just somebody who wanted the person to feel the least pain possible as they were being murdered. This is somebody who really wanted to look at their victim up close, to see them suffering, to see what they look like when they were dead.
Frank's friends were in little doubt who'd murdered him, Maria and her father. But detectives needed evidence to prove it.
Immediately on inspection of a crime scene of a shooting, you're looking for blood spatter, where the blood may have landed. You're looking for projectiles that may have come from a bullet that's entered the body or may still be in the body. You're looking for shell casings, and you're looking for the angle or the trajectory for where the bullet may have went in. Also, the velocity of blood spatter, how fine the mist is on the wall, or there are a lot of different things that make a shooting different from any other murder.
The blood evidence certainly told a story.
Frank is found dead on the front porch of his home. He's lying in a pool of blood, and it looks as though the blood has been pushed with a broom or something.
That would indicate that someone attempted to clean up the blood or wipe the blood.
Investigators take a piece of the tile floor, and they are able to lift from that a bloody footprint, and it matches to a size 11 Dr. Scholl's escape model sneaker, the same kind of shoe that Maria's father, Rocco, is known to have worn.
But what about his daughter Maria? Could it be proved she was at the scene?
Finally, they found a rubber glove located inside the home. This was a glove that would be typically worn by an individual that was cleaning a toilet or a sink or using some kind of industrial cleaner in their home. That glove ultimately had DNA belonging to Maria Spencer inside of it.
Investigators also noticed two absences from the scene: Frank's truck and his dog.
On the morning of July 1st, 2012, the police were able to gather video surveillance from local stores and businesses that operated along the highways that surrounded Frank Spencer's home. They were able to piece together Frank's coming and goings from the night before and the morning after the June 30th baseball game. They figured that the murder happened at about 8:30 in the morning on July 1 because they saw his Harley-Davidson pickup truck leaving along the highways adjacent to his home in and around the 9 a.m. Point in time.
The quality of the video wasn't sufficient enough to tell who was driving the vehicle, but one thing was clear is that someone was driving Frank's truck from the crime scene.
The vehicle was located in Sunbury Township, which is a township wherein Maria Spencer, her brother, owns a bar. The first piece of evidence found in that vehicle was Mr. Spencer's wallet, which was loaded with cash and credit cards. So the police eliminated robbery as a motive for his killing pretty quickly.
When the truck was found, there was no sign of Frank's dog.
As police continue their investigation, they get some help from an unlikely source. About an hour away from Frank's house, these two wedding planners are setting up for a wedding. And all of a sudden, this dog walks in, this Weimaraner, and he's happy and healthy and wagging his tail, and he's clearly somebody's dog. He's not a stray. And, the couple doesn't know what the deal is, but they report this dog, has just turned up at our place. As it turns out, this dog was Frank's dog, Muttley.
The dog was found near a catering facility about 10 miles away from the home of Rocco Franklin.
The wedding venue was on the North Susquehanna Trail at Dauphin, 40 miles south of Frank's home and just a few miles from Harrisburg, where Rocco had lived since his release from prison.
The police concluded pretty quickly that Mr. Franklin's activities included taking Mr. Spencer's truck, loading the truck with Mr. Spencer's dog, going to the son's bar in Sunbury, and then making his way back to his home, where the dog was left unharmed at a catering facility and later recovered that day.
As detectives were building a timeline of events around Frank Spencer's death, he was on the mortuary slab in Bloomsburg. What the coroner found would paint an even more intriguing picture as to how Mr. Spencer had died.
As investigators determined that the first shot was from a rifle and possibly a longer distance, they expanded the crime scene. They went into the woods.
Detectives were closing in on a former mobman and his daughter, a woman, it seemed, made for murder. Both Rocco Franklin and his daughter Maria were heavily implicated in the death of Frank Spencer, but both were still free, evidence still being gathered.
Investigators determined that Frank had actually been shot by two guns. One was a rifle shot at a long distance. The other was a close-up shot, and that would indicate something more personal.
When It's discovered that a shot may have come from a rifle or a long-range weapon. We're going to try to determine where that shot was fired from.
They search the area, and it's at this point of the year, it's summertime, so the woods are all leafed out, and it would be easy for someone to hide out in the woods.
They went into the woods and they found a tree that was Y-shaped, perfect for steadying a rifle for a shot.
A tree stand was set up in a tree about 150 feet up a hill directly across the street from Frank Spencer's home.
They search this area where this tree is, and they find a spent bullet casing, and then they also find a soft case for a rifle there.
They believe the first shot came from Rocco Franklin, who was perched across the street in the tree stand, having used a long gun or a rifle to shoot the first shot that they believe went through Mr. Spencer's neck.
And then someone got closer to Frank as he lay on the ground.
They think, and have argued at trial, that a second shot occurred after Frank dropped at the front door after the first shot made contact with him. They believe that second shot came from a handgun. They recovered a bullet from the body of Mr. Spencer. So they believe there were two shots. They believe the second shot was discharged from a handgun at close range and actually killed Frank Spencer.
Detectives could not prove who had fired the shots. Forensic evidence placed Maria and her father at the scene, but it did not prove that they had fired the weapons.
A couple of months go by, and when police are trying to get them to talk, they call Maria in for questioning, and she refuses. They call Rocco in, and he's, okay. So he goes in and he agrees to talk to investigators, and they ask him, where were you on the day of? And Rocco is, he loves this kind of cat and mouse game.
During that interview, Rocco said that he had not left his home in Harrisburg.
Detectives knew differently.
The cell phone contacts that Mr. Franklin had showed him at or near the catering location in Harrisburg where the dog was found. They also located him in and around the Sunbury Township area where the F-150 had been found.
Questioned about the presence of his DNA and fingerprints at the crime scene and on Frank's truck, Rocco Franklin told a fantastical story.
They say, we know you were at Frank's house. Oh, that's right. I forgot. I went to Frank's that day to clean. I was doing some laundry, and I used a push broom to sweep the floors.
He said that at one point he wanted to test drive Frank's truck and purchase it. And Frank's response to him was, I'll wrestle you for it.
So obviously you can see that he's trying to put together a reason why his DNA would show up at the scene. And he's enjoying every minute of it.
Circumstantial evidence mounting in August 2013, 13 months after Frank's murder, prosecutors convened a grand jury to determine if there was enough evidence to charge Maria Sanuti Spencer and her father, Rocco Franklin.
In the months leading up to the indictment of Maria and Rocco were asked to come to testify before the investigating grand jury in Pennsylvania. Ultimately, she went before that grand jury, as did Rocco, and gave statements that were obviously under oath.
Maria, in her testimony, just goes on and on and on. She barely stops talking. She denies, of course, everything. She denies terroristic threats and everything else. But the authorities have the evidence. And so they file charges on her. They file charges of 12 counts of perjury, more than a dozen other charges, and most importantly, the murder of Frank Spencer.
In a process fraught with delays, Maria was not arrested until July 28, 2014, 2 years after Frank's death.
Detectives go to arrest Maria, and she freaks out. On the same day, authorities also issue a warrant for Rocco's arrest, but he is nowhere to be found. He has flown the coop.
Shortly after the grand jury testimony was taken, Rocco Franklin disappeared from the United States. Nobody knows how he got there, but he ended up living in Argentina. Ultimately, he was located, he was detained, and he fought extradition. During the time that he was fighting extradition, the trial of Maria Spencer commenced.
It was November 2015 when Maria stood alone in the dock to answer for Frank's death.
Motive was the government's biggest piece of evidence. They had piles of text messages, piles of police criminal reports, piles of circumstantial evidence of her involvement in property crime. She had the motive, she had the anger.
I'm not with you. I need it, Spencer. I'm done. You didn't get the last message?
She had the ability, with her father having been out on parole, and that she was the driving force to get her father behind the property crimes, the arsons, and ultimately his murder.
You don't win unless I let you in. Do you understand? You don't win, Spencer.
One of the more prominent statements attributed to Maria took place at a football game shortly after Frank Spencer's murder, where she allegedly said to one of his friends that she was responsible for the murder and that he might be next if he steps out of line with Maria and Rocco.
One of Frank's friends comes up to Maria, just wants to be safe, and he says, Maria, I would never do anything to, in front of your kids. I would never do anything to disrespect you. And she looks at him and she says, that's why you're still alive. But then she goes on and she says, the last thing he saw before he died was me.
Maria clearly decided that she was going to continue to terrorize everybody that Frank was associated with, even after his death. And in some ways, she was even gloating about the fact that she was responsible for his death, saying to his friends that she was the last thing or the last person that Frank saw right before he died. And I think that she wanted to maintain that control and dominance over everybody in that social circle. She wanted to let them know that if any of them stepped out of line, they could end up just like Frank.
The outburst was more evidence placing Maria firmly at the scene of Frank's death, and may even have proved that she fired the bullet that killed him.
The government argued that Maria was the perpetrator of the second fatal shot. In other words, she was the first individual onto the decking after Mr. Spencer was shot by Mr. Franklin from the tree stand across the street, and that she approached Mr. Spencer as he lied in blood outside his front door on the porch deck and administered, so to speak, the kill shot with a small handgun.
Maria and her lawyers refuted this version of events.
Lots of physical evidence, electronic data-based evidence suggested that Mr. Franklin was the sole perpetrator of the crime. We still believe that, and we still think that Maria didn't have the physical or mental capacity to do what they claimed she did.
On November 18th, 2015, the jury retired to consider its verdict.
A jury and jury deliberations are always nail-biters because they're humans, and no two humans are alike. So you can have a room of 12 people, and 10 could be thinking the same thing, but the other two don't.
After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury comes back. Maria Spencer is found guilty on all charges: the murder of Frank Spencer, 12 counts of perjury, arson, conspiracy, terroristic threats. They sentence her to life without parole plus 50 years.
In Pennsylvania, if you're convicted of first-degree murder, the only sentence you can get is a mandatory life sentence. She received additional time for some of the additional offenses. She's currently housed in a state correctional facility in Pennsylvania and will be for the rest of her life in the event that her appeals are unsuccessful.
I believe that because Maria had escaped the law for so long and that she had a long history of escalating from domestic violence to threats on Frank and Frank's lover's life to setting a fire, burning a house down, and then finally to the murder itself, it was always going to escalate more and more as she got away with more, because there was a thrill in getting away with the things that she did. And the more that she got away with, the more she became emboldened to take the next step.
In October 2018, after a lengthy extradition process, Maria's father returned to face justice.
2 years later, her father, Rocco, goes on trial, and he too is found guilty. He's guilty of Frank's murder, arson, and burglary. The jury sentences him to life without parole plus 45 years.
He had been a man of the mafia and had helped raise a daughter who appeared predestined to kill.
When we look at people who grow up with possible psychopathic links or traits, we think about it as a combination of both biological influences as well as environmental influences. And in this case, Maria really had both because her father was a well-known criminal, a mobster, and I believe that she looked at the way he solved problems and took a lot from them as she grew up and decided that this was going to be the way that she would get through her life and make people fearful of her and get what she wants.
And what she wanted was to see her husband dead at her hands. A woman made for murder.